Back when I was 20 during the summer, right before my senior year of college, I managed to land an internship at a financial services firm downtown. It wasn't glamorous by any stretch. Most of my days were spent buried in spreadsheets, double-checking numbers, formatting reports, and doing the kind of repetitive data entry that makes time feel like it's crawling, but it paid well enough to matter, and more importantly, it looked solid on a resume. For someone trying to break into a competitive field, that kind of line on LinkedIn can open doors. There were 7 other interns in my group, and they had us all packed into this open office section with low-walled cubicles arranged in tight rows. The dividers were high enough to give the illusion of privacy, but low enough that you could see the top half of someone's face if they stood up straight. It created this strange atmosphere where you could keep to yourself if you wanted, but you were never truly alone. 5 of the interns were easygoing, normal college students, people who understood this was just a stepping stone and treated it like one. We'd joke quietly, complain about Excel, grab lunch together, and count down the hours until 5. Then there was Eric, who treated the internship like it was the final round of a Fortune 500 interview. He barely spoke, typed aggressively like he was racing an invisible clock, and carried himself like every email he sent was being evaluated by the CEO. And then there was Alex. When I first met Alex, nothing about him immediately screamed problem. He seemed a little awkward, sure, but honestly, most of us were. First day jitters have a way of making everyone feel slightly off. He was tall and thin, almost lanky, with pale skin and dark hair that hung over his forehead in a way that always looked slightly greasy, like he'd run his hands through it one too many times. He didn't fit the polished finance intern stereotype, no crisp haircut, no overly confident handshake, but that alone didn't bother me. What did bother me, though, was the way he behaved around me specifically. At first, it was subtle enough to ignore. He'd randomly appear at my cubicle during the day, and because the walls were so low, I'd see the top of his head slowly rise into view before anything else. The first time it happened, it genuinely startled me. It was like watching someone stand up from underwater. Then his whole face would appear, tilted slightly to the side, with this stretched, unmoving grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. He'd lean forward over the divider, making himself look unnaturally tall, almost distorted by the angle, and start speaking in this deliberately strange voice, like he was performing a character he thought was hilarious. I'd laugh awkwardly, assuming it was some kind of joke I just wasn't fully getting. He'd say things like, working hard or hardly working, Ronnie, but he'd drag out the words in this slow, almost theatrical tone, holding eye contact longer than normal, keeping that frozen smile in place a few seconds too long after he'd finished speaking. It felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in the mirror. The first couple of times, I brushed it off. Internships can be socially weird environments. People try too hard to be memorable or quirky. I told myself he was probably just awkward and trying to stand out in his own offbeat way. But then it became a pattern. Every single day, without fail, I'd see his head gradually lift above my cubicle wall at least once. Same grin, same tilted head, same off-putting voice. Sometimes he'd mutter phrases that didn't connect to anything we were doing. Other times he'd make jokes that didn't land, then just stare at me like he was waiting for something more than a polite chuckle. The tone he used was soft but taunting, almost like he was testing how uncomfortable he could make the moment without crossing an obvious line. The best comparison I can think of now is the voice Charlie Hunnam used when he portrayed Ed Gein. It had that eerie, controlled quality, like calmness layered over something unstable. What made it worse was that he only did it to me. The other interns noticed his behavior, sure, but they interpreted it differently. A few of them would laugh and say, "Alex is so weird," like it was harmless comic relief in an otherwise dull office. I think they assumed he and I had developed some kind of inside joke or strange rapport that they just weren't part of. But that wasn't the case at all. I never encouraged it. I never reciprocated. If anything, I tried to keep our interactions as brief and neutral as possible. Still, it felt like I'd somehow been assigned the role of audience to whatever unsettling act he was trying to perform. It wasn't friendly banter. It felt targeted. As the weeks went on, his drop-ins grew longer and more intrusive. He wouldn't just pop up, deliver a line, and leave. He'd linger. He'd lean over the cubicle wall and stay there, elbows resting on the divider, staring down at me while I tried to focus on my screen. Sometimes he'd barely speak at all, just maintain that smile and eye contact in silence. I'd fake a laugh, glance back at my monitor, say something like, "I've got to finish this report before the meeting," hoping he'd take the hint. Most people would. He rarely did. There were moments where I could feel my heart rate spike slightly when I saw the top of his hair appear again. Because I knew what was coming, the grin, the voice, the prolonged staring. It's strange how something so small can start to wear on you when it happens every day. It stopped feeling quirky and started feeling intentional. About 6 weeks into the internship, things escalated in a way I didn't expect. One night, I was at home eating dinner with my family, trying to unwind after a long day of staring at spreadsheets. My phone buzzed on the table with a call from a number I didn't recognize. I usually ignore unknown numbers, but I was waiting on a delivery confirmation that week, so I figured it might be related. I excused myself, picked up the phone, and said hello. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just silence on the other end. No background noise, no static, just quiet. I almost hung up. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a voice that made my stomach drop instantly. It was soft, slow, unmistakable. And I recognized it immediately. It was Alex's voice. Not just similar to it, exactly it. The same deliberately distorted, almost theatrical tone he used when he leaned over my cubicle wall, like he was playing a character only he understood. But this time it wasn't quiet or controlled. It was louder, sharper, like he was projecting into the phone on purpose. He dragged out the words slowly, stretching each syllable as if he were delivering the punchline to some private joke or reciting a riddle he expected me to solve. The way he said my name made my chest tighten, and then without warning, he exploded into laughter, this erratic, unhinged, over-the-top laugh that didn't sound human in the normal sense. It wasn't casual laughter. It wasn't playful. It sounded manic, like someone pushing too far just to see what reaction they'd get. Before I could say anything, before I could even process how to respond, the line went dead. What made my skin crawl wasn't just the call itself. It was the realization that I had never, not once, given Alex my number. We weren't friends. We never exchanged contact information. We barely spoke outside of those bizarre cubicle encounters. My hands were actually shaking a little when I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the screen. I immediately texted the number back, keeping it simple. "Is this Alex?" The message didn't even go through. Instead, I got that automated response saying the number couldn't receive texts. That's when I looked it up. It wasn't a cell phone, it was a landline. Seeing that somehow made it worse. A landline felt more deliberate, more intentional, like he'd gone out of his way to make the call harder to trace casually. That's when the fear really started to settle in. How did he get my number? I ran through every possibility I could think of. Maybe there was a company contact sheet floating around somewhere. Maybe he'd seen it on a shared document. Maybe I'd written it down on something absent-mindedly. I tried to build logical explanations because the alternative, that he'd somehow dug for it specifically, was harder to sit with. But even if he had found it through work, that didn't explain the tone, the delivery, the laugh. I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. It looped over and over while I tried to finish dinner, while I brushed my teeth, while I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. That laugh didn't sound like someone messing around. It sounded like someone enjoying the fact that they'd unsettled me, like he wanted me to feel watched, targeted. This wasn't quirky office behavior anymore. It crossed a line into something personal. When Monday morning came, I went into the office with this knot in my stomach, half expecting to see him already at his desk, waiting for me to look up. But his chair was empty, his computer was off. I didn't see him all morning. Around midday, I went to our supervisor, Martin, trying to sound casual even though my heart was pounding. I asked him if interns had access to employee contact information, specifically phone numbers. He looked genuinely confused and said no, interns didn't have clearance for that kind of information. Then he casually added that Alex had been let go at the end of the previous week. Apparently, he hadn't been completing assignments, had ignored multiple warnings, and management decided to cut him before the internship wrapped up. Hearing that made my stomach drop even further. The call had come after he'd already been fired. That's when I told Martin about the phone call. His expression shifted from confusion to concern pretty quickly. A couple of the other interns overheard the conversation and drifted closer. When I described the voice and the laugh, a few of them exchanged looks. One of them said, "I always thought he was kind of creepy." Another admitted he'd made her uncomfortable a few times too, standing too close or staring too long. I finally explained the daily cubicle visits, the weird voice, the way he'd linger and just watch me. Saying it out loud made it feel more real than it had in my head. Martin told me not to worry, that Alex was gone for good and had no reason or authorization to come back to the office. He said if anything else happened, to let him know immediately. That reassurance helped, at least on the surface. For the next week, I stayed on edge. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart skipped. Every time I walked to my car after work, I glanced around the parking garage longer than usual. I kept expecting another call, another message, some kind of escalation. But nothing happened, no unknown numbers, no strange sightings. The office returned to its normal rhythm of coffee breaks and spreadsheet deadlines. Slowly, I convinced myself that maybe that one call had been his last attempt at some twisted joke before disappearing. Maybe he just wanted one final reaction. Then came that Friday morning. It was around 5 a.m., still mostly dark outside except for that thin, gray pre-dawn light barely pushing through the blinds. I woke up suddenly, not from a dream, but because I was sure I'd heard something. Maybe gravel shifting or a faint thud outside. It was subtle, but enough to pull me fully awake. My room was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes small noises feel amplified. I lay there for a few seconds, listening, trying to decide if I'd imagined it. Then I sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed. Something in my gut told me to check. I walked slowly to the window and pulled the blinds apart just enough to look out. I wish I hadn't looked. The second I parted the blinds, I felt that instant, sinking regret, like I just confirmed something I wasn't ready to see. Standing in my backyard, positioned halfway between the tree line and the faint yellow glow of the porch light, was a figure staring directly up at my window. Even in the dim pre-dawn light, when everything outside looked washed in gray, I recognized him immediately. The thin, almost bony frame, the slouched shoulders pulled unnaturally straight, the messy dark hair that looked like it hadn't been combed in days. It was Alex. There was no doubt in my mind. For a few seconds, my body completely locked up. I couldn't step back. I couldn't close the blinds. I just stood there, frozen, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, like maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But he didn't move. He just stood there, perfectly still, looking up at me like he'd been waiting for me to notice him. Then he opened his mouth and called out my name. Clear as anything, that same exaggerated, drawn-out, almost theatrical voice he'd used in the office. He stretched my name into this long, sing-song sound that echoed faintly in the quiet morning air. Hearing it outside my house, outside of work, shattered any illusion that this had been harmless awkwardness. This was intentional. This was planned. My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I grabbed my phone off my nightstand, my hands clumsy and shaking as I fumbled to unlock it, ready to dial 911. Before I could hit call, I saw him tilt his head back slightly and begin laughing. Not a chuckle, not nervous laughter. It was loud, sharp, and hysterical, the exact same manic laugh I'd heard through the phone days earlier. It carried through the yard in a way that didn't sound right, like it didn't belong in a normal human moment. It sounded detached, unhinged, like he was completely disconnected from the reality of what he was doing. Adrenaline finally snapped me out of my paralysis. I shoved the window open and shouted at him, my voice cracking as I yelled that I was calling the police and that he needed to get the hell off my property. I waved my phone out the window so he could see it, hoping the threat alone would make him run. For a brief second, he just stood there staring, that same faint grin tugging at his face. Then, almost casually, he turned around and began walking toward the trees behind my house. He didn't sprint. He didn't panic. He just walked, shoulders relaxed, still laughing softly to himself as he disappeared into the darkness of the woods like he'd never been there at all. I called the police immediately, my voice unsteady as I explained that a former coworker had been standing in my backyard at 5 in the morning. The dispatcher asked if he was still on the property. When I said no, she told me officers could drive by, but there wasn't much they could do unless he returned, attempted to break in, or made a direct threat. Technically, he hadn't crossed into the house. He hadn't touched anything. He just stood there. The responding officer took a report, walked around the perimeter with a flashlight, and left after reminding me to call again if anything else happened. And that was it. No arrest, no confrontation. Just a report filed somewhere. I never saw Alex again after that morning. Not at the office, not in town, not even randomly while driving. It was like he'd vanished completely. The police couldn't pursue much since there was no break in and no explicit threat, so the situation just lingered in that uncomfortable gray area. It became one of those experiences you're forced to live with, hoping it truly ended when it seemed to. The rest of the summer passed quietly. No more calls, no more sightings. I finished the internship, and on my last day, my boss pulled me aside and offered me a permanent position after graduation. At the time, I accepted automatically. It felt like the logical next step, but deep down there was this small, persistent knot of unease about ever returning to that building full time. I never told them about what happened that morning in my backyard. Part of me didn't want to relive it, and part of me knew it wouldn't change anything. Alex was already gone. No one seemed to know where he'd ended up. As time went on, I tried to make sense of it in ways that would let me sleep easier. I told myself maybe he was dealing with some untreated mental illness or a serious social disorder, something that blurred boundaries and distorted reality for him. It was the only explanation that helped me process how someone could shift from being an awkward, slightly strange intern to standing outside my house before sunrise, laughing like it was some private performance. A few years have passed now. I never actually went back to that company. I ended up accepting a different job after graduation, partly for better pay, partly because I wanted distance from that entire chapter. Most days, I don't actively think about Alex anymore. Life moved forward like it always does. But every so often, usually when I wake up before dawn and the house is still quiet, I'll remember that image. Him standing there in the half light, staring up at my window like he belonged there. And it still unsettles me in a way I can't fully describe. I still don't know how he got my number. I still don't know how he found my address. Maybe it wasn't that difficult. Information is easier than ever to find online if someone is motivated enough. What bothers me more is not knowing what he wanted that morning. Was he trying to scare me? Was he expecting me to come outside? Was it all some twisted joke in his mind? All I know is that for a few months of my life, I worked side by side with someone who wasn't just socially awkward or eccentric. There was something much deeper going on beneath the surface. And no matter how much time passes, I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of him laughing in the dark, like the whole thing was one big joke that only he understood.